we continue our work at the Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and we welcome everyone in this room and all our viewers. This is the first public consultation about the new gender policies of Ukraine. I now turn the floor over to Ms. Nanivska. And the other speakers will be Ms. Kateryna Levchenko, the president of the NGO Strada, Ukraine. Ms. Nanivska herself, scientific director of the think tank Yaroslavna, Collegium East. Veronika Marchuk, president of the International Embassy of Women Entrepreneurship and organizer of campaign Liubysh Nebi. Dianova, the artist and creative director of the NGO White Ribbon Ukraine. Oksana Dyptan, consultant and psychologist. Ms. Marchuk, we have already mentioned. So let me now give the floor to Ms. Nanivska. I'm sorry, I also forgot to mention Mr. Andrii Tarnopolskyi, who is the chairman of the board of the Ukrainian Geospatial Data Center. I am pleased to greet you all here, and our NGO Collegium, Yaroslavna Collegium East. We now introduced a new plan of the introduction of the new gender policies in Ukraine. We are living at the time when everybody is expecting the new elections, and many even are concerned that these elections might be held in advance of the set for them a date. About 70% though of the voters, according to the recent polling, declare themselves to be reluctant to vote at all at any political elections in this country. The organization with whom we cooperate, this Yaroslavna Collegium, is an NGO, and it cooperates with White Ribbon NGO. This is the director of this organization, Ms. Veronika Mudra, who is going to present the agenda of their organization and of this new policy for the new gender policy, or new initiative for the new gender policy, and will present her some of her colleagues. Well, let us start our consultation, public consultation on the new gender policies in Ukraine. We, the White Ribbon Ukraine organization, and this Collegium of Yaroslavna East are the authors of this new gender policy initiative. The main points of concern are the growing domestic violence, and therefore it brought us to the idea of the need for Ukraine to join the convention, the International Convention on the Rights of Women and Prevention of Domestic Violence. In Washington next September, early September, there will be a conference on Ukrainian issues, and gender policy and domestic violence specifically will be made a point of discussion, because especially after these hostilities broke out in the east of Ukraine, with a number of the servicemen, Ukrainian servicemen returning home, these cases of domestic violence increased dramatically. So the overcoming of these domestic violence cases, instances, is very important an issue for us. We are going to turn Ukraine into a harmonious state where family life and gender need to contribute to this harmonization of social relations in Ukraine. We hope that there will be, as a result of these new policies, gender policies that we put forward, the gender discrimination, sexism will be overcome, and there will be better enforcement of the equal rights guaranteed by the current legislation of Ukraine. We hope that as a result of these policies, the rights of women will be better protected and brought into correspondence to international standards. Ukraine will need to better use the mechanisms of international cooperation and co-financing of similar initiatives. And Ukraine will need to involve more international specialists for the implementation of these policies. Among our strategic partners were the governments of a number of countries, including the United States, some international organizations, including the World Bank, the IMF, the Ivanka Trump Foundation, for example, recently received $100 million, or rather allocated $100 million for the improvement of gender policies in a number of countries. We hope that it will be the case for Ukraine. What are the current problems? Some educational problems, for example. We do not have a system, any governmental system of collection and analysis of the information about domestic violence. This is at the time when we have the growth of domestic violence and rapes, the number of these things growing to epidemic level practically. According to the United Nations statistics, 68% of Ukrainian women have been subjected to domestic violence. Women suffer from domestic violence instances much more than of any robberies or rapes or road traffic accidents taken together. 35 to 50% of women who are hospitalized are the victims of domestic violence, and approximately 15, at least 15 women an hour currently become victims of domestic violence in Ukraine. There is a certain number of stereotypes in Ukrainian society with regard to gender equality. These instances of domestic violence are mainly perceived and interpreted by the majority of Ukrainian public as exclusively personal interrelationships, cases of malfunctioning interrelations, purely individual. And as I have already mentioned, according to the United Nations statistics, less than 2% of women who suffered domestic violence turned to the government authorities and law enforcement authorities. So last year, for example, it was there was 160,730 people who registered these cases against them. Also, there is no educational system of gender education, and Some of the religious communities, non-traditional religious communities, they also oppose any enforcement of gender equality. In principle, at this moment, there have been no information campaigns conducted at any tangible level with the representatives of these religious communities. Therefore, we think that some lobbying and some educational campaigns are needed before any gender-related legislation is debated in Parliament. And we also highlight the lack of any prevention practices against domestic violence in Ukraine. We also want to draw the attention of the public to the lack of proper reaction by the media to these instances of domestic violence and to this problem in general. So that's as far as the educational and information side of this problem is concerned. So, as of now, we can say that the public is excluded from this process of the improvement of the legislation on gender issues. There are no scholar research, scientific researchers on the level of on the gravity, so to say, of this problem in Ukrainian society, and there are no lobbying efforts. There have been no lobbying efforts with regard to the improvement, to the need to improve the legislation of gender policies. So. The problem of the lack of proper legislation is the one that, in our view, prevents or inhibits rather better prevention efforts with regard to domestic violence. The next problem is the lack of prevention mechanisms against domestic violence. For example, there was a bill on the prevention of on domestic violence and gender violence, and it was enacted, but there have been no specific regulations on the implementation, on practical implementation of this act. And the last set of problems are institutional problems. The most important is the lack of any mechanism of rehabilitation, protection and rehabilitation of the victims of domestic violence. The structures that exist, they are insufficient for a country of 40 million people like Ukraine. And we advocate closer attention from all the branches of power in Ukraine, including for example, the court system, like, for example, the restraining orders are very rare, and there is no legislation for the judiciary branch to issue these restraining orders with regard to the perpetrators of domestic violence. So the Prosecutor General's office and the other law enforcement agencies could be more involved in this process. And the notorious problem of corruption in all branches of power in Ukraine that also prevents proper dispensation of justice in the cases of domestic violence. The grave problem is also the low income overall, all across the country in many sectors of economy and the labor market, which also aggravates this problem of domestic violence. Therefore, we consider that international assistance and financial assistance is very important for Ukraine in this realm. And let me now briefly inform you about before I give the floor to the experts, the ways, as we see them, of resolving the gender policy problems. First of all, it's the information campaigns supported by the government, preventing sexism, gender inequality, and domestic violence. Also, the improvement of the work of mass media for them to be more effective in delivering this message to the public at large. And we also consider it necessary for the Ministry of Education of Ukraine to introduce some publicly supported programs on gender education for the students, school pupils in the country. And then it's the work with the religious communities to involve them more actively in the efforts of gender equality. So this information and explanatory campaigns should be made more active, and the work with the perpetrators of domestic violence should also be more effective. But we need to start with the proper system of registration of the acts of domestic violence. The next step, in our view, should be a creation of TV shows, radio shows, in order to publicize the views of the opinion leaders who can suggest effective ways and means of preventing domestic violence in Ukraine. We would also like to propose the 25th of November to be proclaimed, to be declared a national day of prevention of domestic violence. We can call it the White Ribbon Day. And we also advocate the public campaign conducted jointly by all the interested NGOs for 16 days against domestic violence. We also deem it necessary to make a special psychological rehabilitation program for the Ukrainian servicemen returning from the area of hostilities with the pro-independence militias in the east of Ukraine. As I've already said, the regulations need to be adopted that would make possible the efficient implementation of this new Act on Prevention Domestic Violence. We think that we need to strengthen cooperation and try to form some synergies in the work of the NGOs working in this area and the governmental agencies and entities who are in charge in this policy, gender equality policy. Also, the specialists and experts should be trained who can specialize on this issue. This should be done probably with the assistance and through cooperation with our international partners. And also the system of shelters and rehabilitation centers for the victims of domestic violence should be created. And certainly it is all that set of problems is interconnected with the corruption problem in Ukraine, because corruption prevents efficient work of the judiciary. Many of these cases they end up in courts with the perpetrators being just released unpunished. So we think that one of the important tools here should be strengthening of international cooperation between Ukraine and the leading countries, where the countries who are the leaders in resolving these problems, like, for example, the United States, some other European countries. And let me now give the floor to a representative of Strada, Ukraine. This organization is very efficient, and it was even appraised by the State Department of the United States. Let me start with the first question. Like this: why do you call it the new gender policies or a new gender policies? Well, we decided to call the set of initiatives that we propose a new gender policy because Ukraine is now in the process of not only adopting and enacting new laws that guarantee gender equality, but also many of the already existing laws that have already been in effect for a number of years have not yet been implemented. So for our society, this approach that we offer is rather innovative, and therefore, I think even if we enhance this notion of of innovation in this area, it would be more beneficial and would bring about more positive perception by the public and more active participation of the public in these efforts. Then my next question is why is this new set of initiatives that you call a new gender policy is mostly related to this problem of domestic violence? Well, it's not only domestic violence, it's also about sexism in general, prevailing sexist attitudes among the public in the society. Domestic violence then is not only related to violence against women, sometimes and even ever more frequently children suffer from domestic violence too. And this epidemic growth of domestic violence that has gained that scale, especially in the last couple of years, it needs to be addressed, and with the initiatives that I have already mentioned. Well, for the sake of discussion, let me disagree with you and present an alternative point of view on the gender issues in Ukraine. Well, first of all, the definition of policy itself. A dictionary says that it's a combination of methods and means and instruments of expressing public interest in a certain area or in a certain field. So, in my view, if we speak about gender policies, we need to speak about the essence of this policy. So basically it's the provision of equal rights for men and women in the society. The law, under this exact name, on guaranteeing the equal rights for men and women, was enacted by the Parliament yet in 2005. And it provides for a whole set of measures that, if implemented, could be quite efficient and effective. If we speak about policy, the contents of which is the equal rights of men and women, I would advocate Ukraine's constitution in a couple of articles of which these rights are guarantees, and if we speak about the institutional capacities of the implementation of these rights, I would agree that it's the governmental agencies that are in charge and can implement these policies in practice. They are rather weak. But the contents, it seems to me, should be this guaranteeing of equal rights. So what else do we need? The need is, as you have rightly mentioned, this better and more efficient implementation of this policy, and some new approaches are certainly needed, especially if we define the level of implementation of these equal gender equality policies in Ukraine as very weak and, let us say, openly stagnant. So it's even been, I even dare say that it's been marginalized. And we need to focus on what is needed in order to make it, you know, a focal point of the government's efforts. We need to speak about the education, as you very correctly pointed out, and about more efficient work of the government entities in charge of that, and certainly better means and ways of the implementation of this policy. Certainly the specialists who can be capable of, who are competent and can be capable of implementing these policies. So this gender competence, so to say, it should be made a condition, a necessary condition for any public servant's effective work in the government. And I absolutely agree with you that we need to enforce the implementation of the principles of the gender policies that have already been embodied in the Constitution and in a number of laws that are already in effect in the country. And in conclusion, I would say that gender policy for me is the use of what we call feminitives. I suggest that white ribbon apply them more actively and intensely. Thank you very much, Kateryna. Let me now turn the floor over to the head of the organization, Harmony of Rights. Let me agree, first of all, with the previous speaker. This definition of the new policy is not so very important. This area, this realm, so to say, of our public life has been in the focus of attention of our organization. For example, we can say that due to our efforts earlier this year, a number of professions that were had earlier been considered prohibited and even were formally prohibited by law for women to practice them have been made available to the women of Ukraine as well. Speaking about our organization and the work we do, we, for example, monitor the publicity and the commercials and all kinds of advertisement that is used in Ukraine with regard to sexism. If we evaluate the advertisement products in Ukraine by a 10 points scale, our assessment is that in Ukraine we have 7 points in terms of sexism prevailing in the advertisement of and commercials of different kinds. We have, for example, denuded women images demonstrated on TV and on billboards and so on. And a number of other instances, and the daily demonstration of these things, they affect even the politicians who are in charge of adopting and implementing the gender equality laws and legislation. Therefore, this tolerance of sexism and gender discrimination even at the top level of the government, make possible the sexist statements by some of the politicians and actions of a sexist nature, thus affecting the equality of rights of women in our country. Another important area is the application of law, the practical application of laws. We can adopt the most ideal laws, but in practical life, when they are not applied, implemented, we oftentimes end up with the situations in which people who become victims or suffer from that, they do not even know how to, reclaim their rights and how to protect them. Who can help them in doing that? Here, for example, we have such institutions as the Ombudsman, Human Rights Ombudsman, and then some governmental entities, like, for example, the Governmental Service for the Safety of Food Products. They might somehow improve the situation with the ads and commercials advertising, food products in which we see these sexist ads and commercials. Mr. Tarnopolskyi, the floor is yours. Well, let me say that if we speak about sexism, then we need to start our discussion with the legislation. The level gender equality issues should be incorporated into our legislation, and unless we do that, the efforts here will be, in this respect, will be futile. In the Parliament, we already have a good dozen of registers, different registers, registering various violations of various laws and so on and so forth. And we only need probably to make, to register these cases of domestic violence and violence against women and children accounted for separately, because the data is already present in the already existing databases and registries. For example, recently, I learned about a case of a new computer programs trying to develop a program that would at least help in distinguishing between male and female last names. So when we have some information on a wrongdoing or even a crime, we can for this data to be used. For example, in the gender equality enforcement, we at least need to somehow separate these wrongdoings, and in order to include them in the analysis of the gender-related violations of law. So, for example, we have these registers, and probably some extension could be added to one of the most detailed registers, so that we could also use the information related to gender violence. So, for example, the data you mentioned on the number of cases of domestic violence, I'm not sure whether these numbers were compiled, in what way these figures were compiled, because as you have said yourself, there is no separate system of registering gender violence or gender legislation violations in Ukraine. So it certainly is interesting and probably very much needed to have such a system, and to do effective steps in order to establish such a system. Ms. Marchuk is the head of the organization If You Love, Do Not Hit. Well, as a square Ukrainian woman who left Ukraine 25 years ago and transferred to Poland, it excited me how different the relations between males and females were in Poland, and that was inspirational for me. So here in Ukraine, I was afraid practically every second man, expecting him to do something against me. When I came to Poland, the situation became different.
I learned a lot in Poland, and this action Veronika mentioned, this was a spontaneous reaction to statistics. I do not know whether it was true, but today I have several materials with me, some printed materials and materials from the internet, and they say that in Ukraine in 1 year about 10,000 women die, and they are killed by their partners, by their husbands, and whether it is true. But if we compare it with Poland, there they have 150 such cases, and together with my colleagues in Poland, we decided to transfer our campaign here in Ukraine, and we believe that women do not know a lot about how to fight with this domestic violence, about the statistics, and I came here and I see, and it's enough for me to speak with people, and I ask them whether they have understanding of what is going on, and I'm really glad that Ukraine has such laws, and that here there are such organizations, but simple people do not have clear understanding of these ideas, and I confirm this as a woman entrepreneur. People are not aware about these feminisms that the representative of La Strada mentioned, and our association of women entrepreneurs. We've called it like this, and we will call it women entrepreneurs, and we will stress that these are women who are entrepreneurs. So we should use more feminisms in our speech, and it would be great to reach this. So we are really glad for invitation. I would like to give the floor to psychologist, to consultant Oksana Dyptan. Good afternoon. I will speak Russian. So I really understand this statistics, these ideas, this opposition, and this contact with Poland is really necessary, and land register is really necessary. But I am for the psychological health of nation. I can say that big problem is psychological state of a person, no matter what role this person plays in society. And while preparing for this dialogue, I saw that not many people who I know, these people are not aware about the importance of gender policy in Ukraine. There is a complete lack of information, and people do not understand these issues. And I believe we should speak more about these topics, and people should know more about their rights, whether it is discrimination, race discrimination, age discrimination, gender discrimination. People do not understand how to address the state for help. If we are speaking about domestic violence, lack of shelters, psychological centers, and platforms for rehabilitation to help these people, people do not understand where to go, whom to address to. So I believe that at the level of legislation, at the level of state, there should be proper programs, and starting from young age, there should be proper education concerning gender, and people should understand these issues, and they should implement it in their further life. So there should be freedom of choice, and it is connected with psychological health of a nation. And in this way, we'll be more powerful, and we will be ready to protect ourselves and others. And people understand the gender issues. And many people do not understand properly the gender issues, and I would like to ask you about your intentions. And I'm really glad to meet Kateryna today. And so this policy, it also protects the rights of men, because there are men who are under psychological pressure from women, and we do not have proper legislation that would protect any social role, whether this is men or woman. People are not protected from the psychological pressure. And I'm really glad that we have such a platform. I'm glad that we have such a beginning. And I really believe that people should be healthy. They should know to whom to address to. I'm for the psychological centers and shelters and psychological platforms. And now I give the floor to the representative of White Ribbon Ukraine, and Dianova, artist, creative director of White Ribbon Ukraine NGO. Good afternoon. I'm really glad to be here today. I would like to say about the media, about art and its and their role, and also in the history of humanity. We know many women who really contributed to the history of economy, arts, and there are paintings, and there are books and films, and women really contribute to it. Madonna, Tracy, Hillary Clinton, Marilyn Monroe, Oprah, and others. And also the Nobel Prize winners, known women, renowned women, who really overcame those psychological barriers, and they are the examples for other women. And in order to sum up, it is important to say, so the mission of the media is important. It is important to cover, to highlight the topics concerning gender rights, both men and women's rights, and people should be directed to do some noble things. So we would like to implement international experience in Ukraine, and our meeting is over, and we thank everyone who watched us and listened to us. So we don't have time for questions. Thank you and goodbye.